Hello, everyone, and inside today's episode of Locked On Canadiens, we have a very special guest. We are talking all things OHL. We are talking Owen Beck, Cedrick Guindon, Vinzenz Rohrer, and so many of the other Habs OHL former prospects now, all inside today's show.
For Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 666 of Locked On Canadiens. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season, more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Do not worry, this episode is not satanic in any sort of nature, unless you are a Leafs fan, at which point we have been your devil on your side for well over 3 years now. I am one of your hosts. I am Scott Metla. This is obviously releasing on Tuesday. We had a very busy Sunday. We were not able to get our normal episode time out, but good things come to those who wait. I'm joined again by my co-host, the active stick, Laura Saba. Laura, we are very excited about this episode as we continue our tour of Habs prospects and prospect experts to help tell us what we need to tell our listeners so we can take credit for sounding smart on this show.
I actually just showed up to work today to hang out with our very special guest because I know the topic today is pretty much your area of expertise, and also you both, I expect to bond over a player that you're both very high on in the Habs system. I just wanted to be around to hear the conversation. I'm very excited about this though, and I'm very excited for our listeners to hear what our special guest has to say about all the Habs prospects.
Yes, we are joined today by lead OHL scout at Elite Prospects, Lauren Kelly. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy to have you here. This is not the first show we've done together. We've done Game Over with Andrew Berkshire, but thank you so much for making the time for us today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. This is my first Locked On podcast ever, so it's great to be here.
We love having people on for their first time on this show here. It's always fun, and we'll hope you'll be back again in the very near future when more OHL related things happen. I'm going to jump right into this because I have been waiting for this because I want to talk about this prospect because I love this prospect. And when I was at the draft and they made this selection, I got out of my 3.5-hour hungover state to celebrate when the Habs picked Owen Beck at 33rd overall. When they picked Slavkovsky, my thought was they have to draft a center. Owen Beck is going to be there at 26, hopefully, and he seems perfect, and they still got him in round 2. Having purchased and read Elite Prospects Guide, I know that you are a huge fan of Owen Beck and were one of his initial supporters as you were putting the guide together and in meetings. What should Habs fans know about Owen Beck, Lauren?
Well, first of all, I was day 2 of the draft. I was so disappointed he didn't go in the first round. I thought, all season, this is what he's been building up for. I thought he deserved to go in the first round. Obviously, everything worked out as it should. I mean, the Canadiens got an absolute great prospect here. Beck is probably not going to be, a first-line center or second-line center. The Habs have Nick Suzuki and Kirby Dach now. So, I could easily see Owen Beck slotting in as their third line center down the road. Just a cerebral, super smart, intelligent player, plays the game both sides, doesn't cheat defense for offense. He's stronger, arguably, off the puck than he is with the puck, and he's got phenomenal tools. His skating is excellent. This is just a player who continued to impress me every single game that I watched this season, which is something that I couldn't say about a lot of prospects out of the OHL in this past draft season, just because, they were coming off the lost season and there was consistency issues. And I wasn't really sure if they were going to keep building across the board, continue to impress me. I was a little more lenient than I would have been in past years, just because I know these players took a year off unexpectedly. And obviously we weren't sure how that was going to hurt their development. So for a player like Owen Beck to keep building and continuing to impress and excel every game that I watched, and I scouted Mississauga the most out of any team this season. It's the closest OHL team to me, so I go out there often for games, but it was just so impressive. He was so impressive to watch, and, he's a great guy, too, off the ice. So
I have a question, and I don't mean this I hate player comparisons to a lot of things, but we mentioned that the Habs went with Slavkovsky at first overall. They still needed to fill the depth at center there. And when they traded up, we thought they were trading up for Shane Wright. I've seen a lot of people say that Beck has a lot of qualities that made Shane Wright a very well-rounded player in terms of his off-the-ice intelligence and knowing where to be. I'm not saying that he can be Shane Wright, but can he be like a lighter version of that to the Habs' benefit if he continues his natural progression here? He's obviously only got the one OHL season because of COVID, but like you said, there's a lot of positive things he's been building on there on and off the puck. Can he be, a slighter version of that for Montreal?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, hype him too much, so to speak. So if he doesn't pan out, okay, well, this person doesn't know what she's talking about. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I mean, Beck was my, after Shane Wright and, Pavel Mintyukov, I thought Beck was the best player out of the OHL in this past draft season. Just the consistency. And I think even on some nights, where there were a lot of complaints about Shane Wright's consistency and, he disappears a little bit in games. He doesn't dominate like an exceptional status player should, or a first overall pick in the NHL should. Whereas, obviously with Beck, the consistency was there night in, night out, every shift. He's going wherever the puck is or wherever he needs to be on the ice. But, the one thing that was in doubt was his production, which is where, Wright really excelled in that regard because, 90 plus points in the OHL versus I think Beck had 51. That kind of probably is what ended up dropping him, just that lack of production. But honestly, I don't think it's out of the question to see that, that could be that Shane Wright light type player down the road.
I think one of the things that jumped out at me when you were talking was when you talked about how strong he was without the puck, and he's as strong without it. And that kind of reminds me of something that Martin St. Louis says a lot, is that he wants to make sure that his players, I do believe he even said that it is more important for them to know what to do when they don't have the puck. I'm very curious as to sort of his hockey intelligence, I think is the way that I'd like to put it, because Martin St. Louis calls that reads. We call that cerebral. Scott and I talk about Nick Suzuki in that way a lot, where he kind of is able to take control of the moment that's happening in the game and kind of sort of turn it around to his advantage and sort of either slow it down or speed it up and really just be the architect of that moment. I'm thinking about, what's the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and they like create dreams and there's an architect of dreams.
Inception.
Inception. Yeah. That's the one. Is he able to inception the ice to his benefit? I mean, I realize that he's got quite a lot more games to play to sort of develop that sense. But do you see a hockey sense and an ability to kind of take control in his game?
Absolutely. I think, that was probably his strongest asset this season, was his intelligence. And just, Mississauga was a great team this year, and I don't think everyone expected them to be as good as they ended up being. And I think a large part of that was due to, their rookies being able to step into the lineup and excel right away. And Beck was one of those guys. And, tracking data, he's the one who was driving Mississauga's offense every single night. And, he didn't always have the puck, but he was, pressuring puck carriers, going to the right areas, stripping pucks, forcing turnovers, chasing after opponents who had the puck down at the other end of the ice just to force a turnover and create a scoring chance. That kind of play is just invaluable. I don't think that's something you can necessarily teach, those kind of instinctual plays where, this player knows where he should be, this player knows how to get the puck back when he doesn't have it. And, going about that in a very intelligent, almost like mechanical way. Like it was just boom, boom, boom. Like he was almost like a robot on the ice. Like, I'm going here, I'm going to get the puck in, I'm going to create a scoring chance off of it. And that's just, it speaks to his intelligence. I mean, this player is incredibly smart. He knows exactly where he needs to be, and he executes what he intends to do. And I think that was just what was so impressive watching him this season.
And we do have so much more with our special guest, Lauren Kelly of Elite Prospects, coming up in one moment. We are talking the other Habs AHL prospects, OHL prospects, and some prospects who are heading to the AHL, and that's all coming up next. But first, today's show is again brought to you by betonline.net. They are the fastest and easiest way to check all of your betting needs. Get all your favorite sports and events. #1 online source for all your odds, lines, games, whatever you need, you can find at BetOnline. That's Major League Baseball in full swing. Hockey's somehow not that far away. Football starts again soon. They have everything that you are looking for, whether it be wagering info, live in-game betting, scores, podcast news. Everything is at betonline.net. You can check that on your computer or on your mobile device to learn more about the action happening. BetOnline, where the game starts. We are back with special guest Lauren Kelly of Elite Prospects. She heads up all their OHL scouting there. We are very, very grateful. It is obviously a very busy offseason. The Gretzky-Hlinka tournament has started. We have World Juniors Part 2 Boogaloo around the corner, and training camps and everything else are just behind that. We've talked about Owen Beck in the first segment here a little bit, and now the question becomes, the Habs picked 2 other players out of the OHL this year. They picked Cedrick Guindon and Vinzenz Rohrer. We talked to Tony Ferrari about Vinzenz, and he was a huge fan of that. And we haven't talked a lot about Cedrick Guindon, who is actually someone I'm very intrigued by because the point totals look decent for the role that he's playing on the team, but I don't know much about that player. Overall, admittedly, I pretend to be a prospect expert on this podcast. That's why we have guests like yourself, so I can continue to pretend that I'm a prospect expert on this podcast. What can you tell us about Cedrick Guindon and what kind of player he is, and what should Habs fans kind of expect from him?
Yeah, well, Guindon, especially at the beginning of the season, it was, a player I was unfamiliar with. But, especially he went on a ridiculous scoring tear, I think, in February, where he was scoring like 4 goals a game, which was just mind-blowing. I think it only lasted for 2 or 3 games, but it was just kind of insane. This is a player who's also, again, very smart. The skating needs a little bit of work. It's a little bit slower for a smaller player. I'd like to see him add a little bit more acceleration and refinement with his edge work. Just a really smart player. He has great offensive instincts. He's good defensively. This is a really solid late round or mid-late round pick for the Habs, and I think they got a good player here. If he can continue to just build on what he did this season in his OHL rookie season, they should be in good shape for down the road.
I was going to say, I keep looking at all these players and I go, wow, none of them scored anything last year, forgetting that there was no OHL season in 2020. And in your opinion, does that kind of impact some of these players' chances that it stunts their development? Like Guindon would be going into, his now 3rd full season in the OHL, but he's got just 1 under his belt at this point. Does that kind of impact what their projection is when you're scouting these players or analyzing them? Or do you kind of refocus given the context that, yeah, all of them lost a season in that regard?
Yeah, I think, you have to be a little bit cautious as to, we don't know how much their development is going to be impacted by missing an entire year at arguably critical time in their development. With players like Guindon, a lot of them started off slow in the OHL this season. And even you could argue Shane Wright didn't look like himself until February. So, development was hurt a little bit by not playing last season. And, even if they didn't play in the OHL, usually the OJHL would be an option for them. And that wasn't even up and running, I don't think. So that there's really no measurement for how much it's going to be impacting a prospect's development. What I was really looking for over the season was just progression. If he's not noticeable on the ice in November, does he look different in March or April? Is he, taking steps forward? Is he producing a little bit more? And there were a lot of prospects, I thought, out of the OHL who continued that progression. Obviously there were some who started off really hot in October, November, and kind of dipped by the end of the season. Is that, a matter of not playing the last season and, tiring out a little bit, the conditioning not being there? There's so many variables with how to approach scouting the OHL last season. It was incredibly difficult to, say whether or not, this is a player worth betting on in a late round of the draft, or if this is just who he is and he's just a really good junior player. He'll be a really good junior player once he, adjusts the OHL, but there's not much there as far as, next steps to the AHL, to the NHL.
And I guess before we end up wrapping on this and getting into our listener questions, we want to know a little bit more about Vinzenz Rohrer, because I'm looking at all these profiles of these players, and everything seems to be trending along the plays hard, knows where to be defensively, and knows how to, read plays and play with intelligence, not just kind of trying to brute force their way through things. They think the game a step ahead there. And like Laura said in our last segment, that's what Martin St. Louis is preaching, is that, be a step ahead and play with your instincts. Does Rohrer kind of fit into that? Out of everyone besides Meshar, who I love for a number of reasons, this is a player who intrigues me most because they have all the markings of someone that comes out of nowhere once they've either grown a little bit in their body or everything just kind of clicks. And I'm wondering, can they be that, third round kind of hidden gem a Braden Point, or not saying he's going to be Braden Point before Lightning fans start yelling at me, I promise. Just that kind of sneaky pick that we've seen teams like Tampa and other organizations find in the rough in the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, for full disclosure, I love Rohrer. I think, he didn't get enough love this season. And I, look at Marco Kasper, another Austrian who went, I think, 8th overall at the draft. And I think they're very similar players. Obviously, Rohrer is a little bit smaller, still quite speedy, very intelligent, and he's just so delightfully violent. It is kind of beautiful to watch. He has kind of mastered this kind of physical, almost chaotically physical game where he doesn't toe the line necessarily, but he throws the body for a smaller player, and he uses it to separate players from pucks. So it's not just kind of running around the ice looking to take someone's head off. It's a very almost intelligent, clinical violence where, he's, reverse hitting. And like, this is like such an odd description of like, so people are going to think I'm insane, but
I love it.
That's like the kind of player he is, just like intelligent violence where, reverse hitting players or, stick checking or, body positioning. I'm like trying to move around. Like this is like a thing, but that's like the kind of player he is. And then, the offense wasn't there at times this season, but, it's probably going to come as he gets more reps in the OHL or, wherever he ends up playing next year, if it's not there. And this, he makes a living out of scoring in front of the net, getting himself open. And he's just that kind of player who is always turned on, that tenacity can't be switched off, so to speak. And so he's always fighting for positioning in front of the net, or he's, charging in on the forecheck. And he's just one of those players who seems to make something happen every time he's on the ice.
We love to see that. It reminds me of mixing a little bit of like Brendan Gallagher, who just loves to get to the front of the net and be a disturbance, but all the smart parts of like an Arturi Lehkonen, who obviously the Canadiens traded away, is that they're always engaged in something. Even if it's not on the score sheet, that engagement is there. And we do have one more segment with our phenomenal guest, Lauren Kelly of Elite Prospects. We took some of your listener questions, and we're going to dive into that coming up next. We are back. It is time for our final segment. I have talked a lot, so I am actually going to turn over the reins slightly to my co-host here, since she also has the questions in front of her, full disclosure. We are again joined by Lauren Kelly of Elite Prospects, their lead OHL scout and awesome person overall. You should be following her on Twitter for all of your scouting needs. The Hlinka Gretzky tournament is going on. Followed all the folks over at Elite Prospects. We love their draft guide, and we love them in general. So I'm going to shift it over. I'm going to give the reins to my co-host who has the questions in front of her. Laura, take it away.
So I want to start with a question that we got on YouTube, because we talked about delightful violence in the previous segment. Speaking of delightful violence, we have a listener, Michelle, on YouTube, who wants to know what potential you see for the future careers of Jan Mysak and Arber Xhekaj.
I'll start with Arber, I guess. That's the thing about delightful or violence is, it can be delightful and it can also be, unwarranted. And, I think Xhekaj, I was hoping to see a little bit more refinement and discipline out of him this season. And I think it's safe to say that we didn't quite get that. I mean, he was suspended 3 separate times this season, all for multiple incidents. There was a slew foot, a fight, and then a headlock, I think, in March, which was, by the OHL standards, they're very strict about suspensions. But, some of these incidents, they're not just, okay, he delivered a bad hit. This is a player, who is lauded for his physical game. And he, when he's on, he can, really turn up the offense, and he can be the great defenseman that, teams like Kitchener and Hamilton have relied on him for. but then, he toes the line physically. How is this going to carry over to when he plays in the AHL next season? Is it going to continue, or the Laval coach is going to be like, okay, you need to tone it down or you're not going to last long in the organization? It's, obviously a little bit disappointing to see how many suspensions he had this season. Granted, again, maybe he's a little rusty from not playing last season. I don't know, but that's a player where I think the production is great, but I think the discipline issues might be more of a concern going forward than I think a lot of Habs fans would have hoped for. As for Mysak, I'm interested to see if he's more than just a great junior scorer. The production was great this season. He was really driving play for Hamilton at both ends of the ice. I see him probably as like a third line checking winger in the NHL if he makes it there. And, I think we're going to get a good sense of where he's at the World Juniors that start next week. I think he's on the Czech roster, but if he's not, then obviously we'll see him at rookie camp, at training camp. And then, if he comes back to Hamilton for another season, that's not a problem either. He also missed or did he play back in the Czech Republic?
He played a handful of games in the AHL. Like, he was a regular in the lineup, but it was very clear that step wasn't quite there yet. The speed was a little bit beyond where he's at. He didn't look like he was lost, but I think people had expectations of more than 2 goals, which is tough. The AHL is a hard step up for a lot of players. And I think now, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, with another year in the OHL under his belt, he was supposed to captain the Czech team. I don't know if he's going to. If he's going, I believe Patrick Fexell had a thing that I'm not sure that he's going or not, just because of camp and, recovering from the Memorial Cup and everything. But like you said, I'm very intrigued to see where he goes. He was lauded as a first-round pick, fell a little bit, and a lot kind of like Owen Beck. It seems like Montreal might have found a steal there. And as for Xhekaj, I'm absolutely terrified of what this kid's going to do next year when the AHL is a little bit more lenient on what you can get away with in terms of some things. And my follow-up question to that is, does he have the skills to actually turn himself into, a solid defensive defenseman like a Joel Edmondson, that they can play that physical style without getting themselves in trouble? Yeah, without murdering people. Exactly.
Well, the thing about Xhekaj is he's not throwing these arbitrarily dangerous hits. It's the little antics post whistle in scrums. Does he toe the line a little bit more there? Absolutely. So if he can rein in that kind of be more disciplined in those kind of scenarios, I wouldn't rule him out at all as far as, the sky's the limit for this guy. He's a great offensive defenseman. I don't know a ton about his defensive game, but, production is great. The discipline is the big question mark right now. We're going to learn a lot from this first AHL season out of him, whether or not he can, be the player that the Canadiens hoped they were getting when they did draft him. And Mysak, he is on the Czech roster, so we should see him play next week. I had it written down. I just need to look.
Oh God, that's next week.
Yeah, starts August 9th. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm getting the vibes we had in the bubble where we were doing hockey podcasts in August. Like, that's the vibe that I'm currently feeling. One thing I wanted to ask about Xhekaj is, every time we talk about his discipline issues and kind of how, again, delightfully violent he is, people get angry with us because they say he's not just a goon. Like, you talk about him as if he's a goon. And I think it's really important to kind of talk about, like, no, we don't think that. But what we want to know, essentially, which is the question that Scott asked, is like, does he have the potential? If he can rein in that discipline, is he going to be able to kind of live up to because the Canadiens took a chance on him, right? Like, it was I believe he was invited to a development camp and then they signed him. Right. So he was somebody where, like, he kind of came out of nowhere and blew everybody away in that camp. He really did. And people were really excited about him. And then you kept hearing, well, it's never really going to happen. It's just one of those things where the Canadiens, get somebody's rights and things like that. I do think, though, that we do he does have potential. And we just have to kind of rein in our own expectations. He needs to rein in his antics, and we need to rein in our own expectations, because I do think he's going to be an effective player in the AHL. I have very high hopes for him in the AHL. The question is, can that then become NHL level play?
Right, yeah. Like, do I think he's going to be a Caden Gooley down the road for the Canadiens? No, I don't think so. I don't think third pairing is out of the question in the NHL, especially, if he can, channel that physicality into a more intelligent way. And then, the offense, he's a guy who can produce from the back end. And I think that's really valuable at, any level of the game. So I definitely think, taking all that, kind of discipline issues aside, this is a player who has a legitimate chance to be an NHL player. There's just factors right now that, we can't ignore, unfortunately. And, the next year in the AHL will be kind of a big tell for us, whether or not, this guy is going to make it in professional hockey.
So we've got another question. Actually, the questions that we got were about Owen Beck that we've already addressed, and it's from Dryford 251. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that question, which was kind of like, what is his ceiling? Do his line mates compliment him? We talked a little bit about, how he was doing in Mississauga. And I'll ask you, because we didn't really get to it in the first part, is like, what do you think are not, I hate calling them weaknesses because that upsets people, but if you were telling him, you need to work on these few things in order to progress and develop into the NHL player you want to be, what are the things that you would think that Owen Beck kind of needs to work on?
Yeah, well, that's actually a very good question. A lot of Owen Beck's, concerns, so to speak, I wouldn't even call them concerns, really were with his production. He wasn't producing enough for a first round pick. The production issues, although, are probably a byproduct of his line mates. I mean, he wasn't playing with top end players last year in Mississauga, often, fourth line, or I would classify them as fourth line OHL players, not highly skilled. So they weren't seeing what he was seeing on the ice as far as offensive sequences go. And then, when he was sending them passes, they weren't open, or the timing was a little bit off, or when they were sending him passes, he was in a different area of the ice because he saw a better opening and found space there. He looked really good with Slavkovsky and Luke Mysak during the playoffs, and I had been begging their head coach, just on Twitter, not actually, knocking this off the door or anything, but I've been begging them to play back with Luke Mysak and Slavkovsky all season, and they finally did it for, I think, 4 games during the playoffs. They looked great together. They didn't score at all, I don't think, but these are also 2 players who were playing out their rookie seasons in the OHL too. So a lot of it, I think, was just timing issues, learning to read off your teammates, the guys you've never played with before. And the funny thing is, he was actually lights out in November. And then, he was the OHL's Rookie of the Month. And then the production kind of dipped a little bit in February, March. And then Mississauga as a whole just struggled to score. They couldn't seem to find the back of the net. And then the other thing with, his production was, goalies in February, March seemed like hellbent on stopping him on the doorstep every shift. And it was just getting ridiculous at that point. Like, this guy is putting himself in areas where, he deserves a goal at least at some point. So I would say, just reading off his line mates a little bit more, maybe instead of going to the place where you can score, maybe trying to figure out what they're doing exactly, to get that. But other than that, I mean, there's very few weaknesses to Owen Beck's game. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and list like a laundry list or anything like that. I mean, he knows exactly what he's doing. He ramped up the physicality a lot towards the end of the season too, laying hits, separating the players from the puck, using good body positioning. And originally I thought that was going to be one of his weaknesses. And then he took it to the next level. So he just seemed to, have an answer for every limitation or weakness to his game. And I think that's what was also so impressive about watching him progress throughout the season.
I think, we are right to be excited about Owen Beck. I think I'm almost at Scott's level. Not yet, but I'm almost at Scott's level with my excitement. And we've got one final question. And it is from our friend Trevor C., who wanted to know about Cameron Allen of the Guelph Storm, who apparently grew up a Habs fan. And so Trevor is hoping, also because Trevor cheers for the Habs, that Cam gets drafted by the Canadiens next season, because those players turn out to be Leaf killers. So I don't know how much of Allen you've watched, but we wanted to know what your thoughts on him were.
Well, I will tell Habs fans right now who are a little bit intrigued by this kind of endorsement that you can watch Cam Allen right now at the Holinka Gretzky Cup for Canada. So I would definitely turn the games on. They just played their first game last night. He was exceptional. I mean, he had 4 assists, just breaking up plays, activating off the point, finding teammates with passes. And, keep in mind, these are players who probably haven't played with each other at all before. So he's probably going to be the OHL's top defenseman for the upcoming draft. I mean, he's in probably a neck and neck battle with Hunter Brustovich, who decommitted from Michigan to come to play for Kitchener next season, which was like a big drama thing that we're like, what is going on? Like, why would you decommit? It's rare, I mean, to see a prospect decommit from the NCAA to come play for the OHL. But, you know, he's another top prospect for next year's draft that, you know, will probably be battling head for head for that top D-man spot out of the OHL with Allen. Allen's just a great player. I mean, he was really, really good for Guelph last season as a rookie, as a, you know, 05 player who was really in his first true rookie season. He held his own all in every viewing that I saw. I mean, I was very impressed with him by the end of the season, but I'm just really excited to see where he can take his game. I mean, this is a breakout wizard, loves to activate, loves to play with the puck, but he reads incoming rush as well, defends the gap well. You know, this is another player, you know, if the Habs are, you know, once again in that top 10, kind of top 15 situation next year, I mean, I don't think it's out of the question to say that, you know, this could be a target for them down the road.
And that's what makes it so exciting, because we know the Canadiens are likely not to be as bad as they were this past season. So a lot of people are like, you know, they have their sights set on Bedard, and we're kind of like, maybe we're talking 5 to 7 spot. And I know that the first round is pretty thin on defensemen, and so, you know, Allen's probably going to be highly coveted at that point. So I hope that there's like a marriage of the scenarios where he progresses with his development in such a way as to be available in the first round, right where the Canadiens are picking. Like, that's what I would like to see, because as you said, he's a really intriguing player, and he's had some really interesting sort of breakout moments.
That, I think, does it for all of our questions. If you want to get a jump on our mailbag for this weekend, we do have another guest coming up for tomorrow's episode talking about a league we haven't talked about yet. You can always send questions to lockedoncanadiens@gmail.com, at @LO_Canadiens on Twitter, where you can follow us and all of our shenanigans. Follow Laura at The Active Stick, and follow myself at Scott Matla. And our guest, Lauren, please tell our lovely listeners where they can find your work and find you on social media.
Yeah, so you can find, I write occasionally for EP Rinkside, mostly OHL content these days. I did dabble a little bit in the NHL at the beginning. And then you guys can follow me at Laura Kelly 24 on Twitter.
We want to thank Lauren. Thank you so much for joining us. I now am more excited about Owen Beck, which is going to make me insufferable at the rookie tournament in September. But people are just going to have to deal with that, because once again, I like to be right in my analysis, like I was with Sean Farrell. No, I will not let that go at this point in time. Folks, when you're done checking out our show, please check out Locked On NHL. It's the off season, but there's still a lot going on around the league, so you can check with all of our local experts and everything else. And we will see you all next time.